Hi, I'm Phil Noble with Envision South Carolina, and we're here in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters of NASA to talk to Columbia's favorite son, Charlie Bolden, the Administrator of NASA. Welcome to Envision.
Phil, thanks so very much. It's good to be here.
You grew up in Columbia.
Grew up in the Waverly section of Columbia, right down the street from C.A. Johnson High School.
And that's where you went to school, right?
That's where I went to school. In fact, I went to the Triangle. I went to Carver Elementary School, which was right through the woods, the equivalent of about a block, and walked past C.A. Johnson up to the new W.A. Perry Junior High School, where my mother was the librarian, and then came back to C.A. Johnson, where my father was my high school football coach, but also at least once the disciplinarian at the school. Only once.
Only once. Well, that's pretty good. Was your family an old South Carolina family?
My family was born and raised. My mother was born in Charleston, as a matter of fact, and became an orphan at the age of 8 when her mother died. And she is the only girl with 3 brothers, and she was a big Episcopalian, so she was taken care of by her aunt and uncle who were Episcopal missionaries. So she lived in Peak, Pomeria, Jenkinsville. They did the circuit.
Right.
And then finally came to Columbia, and she and her brothers were raised right on Marion Street in Columbia, where the big brother, Thomas, who was at Booker T. Washington for a long time as a coach and then at the university, Uncle Buddy, as we called him, he kind of took care of him. But Charleston, Columbia are all my old stomping ground.
And where was your father's family?
My dad was right there in Columbia, born and raised there. He lost a brother very early in infancy, and then he had 3 sisters. One sister, Martha, was in Columbia with him. The other 2 sisters, Lily Mae and Fredrine, were in Harlem on 135th Street, so that's where I spent my summers frequently.
Oh, so you did it the other way around. You went to Harlem for the summer.
We did.
Yeah, that would be fun.
We'd load up, go down to the farmer's market in Columbia. My dad would, no bags in the trunk. We'd fill up with vegetables and corn,
the
ears of corn, collard
deal,
greens, okra, and everything. And so we took vegetables north and brought chock full of nuts coffee back from New York.
Oh, that's great. Your father and your mother were in education. Was that a tradition in your family? Did you have an education tradition?
You know, they were. If I'm not mistaken, they were the first educators in the family. Both of them, but the family was all educators. Uncle Buddy was a teacher, like I mentioned before. His wife was a teacher. On my mother's side, many of her siblings were teachers, and the people around her. And then I married Jackie Bolden, who is also from Columbia, Alexis Bolden, and her mom and dad were teachers, and they had gone to Booker T. Washington with my mom and dad. So
and
I was surrounded by teachers.
You were surrounded by teachers. Not a bad environment.
Not a bad environment.
But and you went to the Naval Academy. Who appointed you?
Well, that's a long story. I was actually appointed by Congressman William Dawson from Chicago, Illinois. You probably may remember back.
Oh, they wouldn't
appoint
black folks.
Not in 1964.
when was? Do you know when was the first African American
appointed from
South Carolina? Yeah.
I don't know, but it was. It wasn't very long after I went because the schools were integrated. I think 2 or 3 years later when. Young Monteith lady went to the University of South Carolina, but I think probably the first person of color was nominated and appointed from South Carolina, probably in the mid-'70s.
So were you the first African American from South Carolina to go to the Naval Academy?
I was, yeah.
Were you conscious of that?
No.
You weren't?
I wasn't conscious of it. I was unconscious. You know, I was aware of the difficulty of getting in. But it was not one of the things that I dwelled on. My mom and dad had always told me, you know, don't worry about things over which you have no control.
Right.
Do your best, study really hard, and prepare yourself, and then try to take advantage of every opportunity that comes your way. And I was actually counting on an appointment from Lyndon Johnson as the vice president. Every young man and lady in the United States is eligible for a vice presidential appointment. He can make appointments across the nation.
Right.
You have to be the son of a Medal of Honor winner or an active duty military person to get a presidential appointment, and Lyndon Johnson was vice president, so I had been writing him for a couple of years about my dream of becoming a midshipman, and because I was pretty sure I wasn't going to get an appointment from South Carolina, and as I mentioned to you in the preliminary, on a dismal November day in 1963 when we got on the bus to go from C.A. Johnson to Charleston to play Burke High School for the state championship. We got word that President Kennedy had been assassinated, and that was, I was doubly devastated. I mean, I could see my dreams of going to the Naval Academy going out the window, because although I had been communicating with Lyndon Johnson and I felt relatively confident, he now was the president, and so.
So the rules, they changed the rules on you.
But I wrote him a letter anyway, and I said, I never heard from him, but I said, Mr. President, I know you can't appoint me, but we've been talking for a couple of years, and I told you that I wanted you to know who I was, because I was going to need you one day. And about a week later, a Navy chief came in from the recruiting office and knocked on the door and said, hey, understand you're interested in going to the Naval Academy. And then shortly after that, a retired federal judge, Judge Bennett, who was from right here in D.C., had been asked by President Johnson to travel around the United States and find, back then it was only males, but young African-American men who were interested and qualified to go to the three principal service academies. And Judge Bennett came to my school, came to C.A. Johnson and talked to me, and the rest is history. I ended up getting an appointment from Congressman William Dawson of Chicago through the candidate guidance office at the Naval Academy.
Fascinating. And when did you first get interested in space?
Oh, a long time later. I did not. I'm one of these people who knew about space. I was kind of a science fiction nut, and so I knew what astronauts were and everything. Yeah. But growing up in South Carolina, I never dreamed I could become an astronaut. And the thing that kind of saved me was meeting Ron McNair, and the late great Ron McNair. Ron had grown up in Lake City, about 42 miles from Columbia. Never knew him. And when I was a test pilot, about the middle of my Marine Corps career, Ron had been selected in the first group of space shuttle astronauts, came to Pax River along with some of the other Navy pilots who were astronauts, and for a weekend. And we met and talked, and before Ron left, he said, hey, are you going to apply for the space program? I said, not on your life. And he said, why not? I said, Ron, they'd never pick me. And he looked at me like I'm looking at you. He said, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. He said, how do you know? How do you know if you don't ask? And so he kind of embarrassed me, and because my mom and dad had always told me I could do anything I wanted to do if I was willing to work for it. So I went back and started doing my application. The unfortunate thing was in the middle of filling out my application, my dad died, and so I went home for his funeral. But the guy for whom I worked, a guy named Bill Griffin, was another Marine test pilot, and Bill finished my application, all the form and stuff, and sent it in for me. And I ended up getting I got selected by the Marine Corps, nominated to NASA, and then invited to go to Houston for an interview with NASA, and I got picked up in the second class of space shuttle astronauts. So I stumbled into it. And that's why I tell kids today, study really hard, work hard, don't be afraid of failure, don't give up on yourself, and just keep pressing.
I think it's interesting that you and Ron McNair obviously are both black and from South Carolina, and obviously had a sense of bonding about that. Let's talk about race in South Carolina. I mean, were you conscious of South Carolina as being racially different?
Oh yeah, no question.
From the very beginning?
But you may remember we'd made the annual trek. In the summertime, we got in the car and started driving north. Or every once in a while, my mom and dad would let me go by myself, and I'd get on the Silver Meteor. Right. And so, I got on. If I went on the train, you got on the Silver Meteor at 8:30 at the train station there in Columbia, and you had to move. When you got to Washington, D.C., you had to move to a different car, a different part of the car. And so I was very much aware of it. And things were really, even though, I was growing up in Harlem in the summertime, and Harlem then was dominantly black, it wasn't all black. Yeah. Not like South Carolina. And there weren't sections of New York like there were sections of South Carolina. I knew places I could not go in South Carolina. I didn't go. You didn't know it. And when I went to the Naval Academy, I was really confused because segregation was still hot and heavy in Maryland. Yeah. There were places we could not go in Annapolis, and but you didn't know what they were because it wasn't supposed to be segregated. So you would, even as a midshipman, you'd go into some places and people would look at you strange and say, I'm sorry, I can't serve you here, and then you'd walk out and frosted,
Right.
ready to choke somebody, but
But
it was okay.
you never did.
No.
You never choked
My
anybody.
mom said, my mother was the voice of reason in my family, and she's like my wife today. My wife has swung on my arm since we got married, forever ago, 45 years ago. And she always accused me of having the small man syndrome, that
Right.
you always want
Right.
to fight.
Right.
So,
Well, talk about, South Carolina, obviously, race was and arguably still is the principal liability that we have to overcome as a state. What about the assets? Was there something about South Carolina that made it different, that enriched you or in some way?
No question in my mind, and I tell people all the time, although I grew up in the segregated South, in a segregated school system where, there was a different pay system for black and white teachers, just vehemently, dramatically different standards and everything. The schools were incredible. My teachers were dedicated. I couldn't do what a kid can do today. If I went in the classroom and I said something to a teacher, let me tell you, that's why I said the one time I was disciplined. I was a wise butt to my trigonometry teacher who had graduated from Johnson C. Smith,
Right.
the same university as my mom and dad, and I was a senior, so I was 17 years old, and she had just graduated from Johnson C. Smith, and she was adorable, and I had the student's crush, and so I was typical 17-year-old. So I wised off in class one day, and she sent me to the office, and whose duty was it that day for discipline but my dad? And back then they used the paddle.
Yes,
And he had a special paddle that had stars in it, so it whistled. And
You heard it coming.
I heard it coming, and then I felt it, and I thought it hurt so bad. And then I got home after football practice.
And then I went through it again.
And I went through it again. He was crushed that he had put me in a position where he had to discipline his own son in school. He never had any trouble out of me in school again. Neither did Shirley Williams or anybody else. So, but it was different back then.
Yeah.
We were latchkey kids. People talk about latchkey. My brother and I, he was 4 years younger than I, and so when we got home, I had the key. We went in,
Right.
we did our homework and stuff like that. Mrs. Owens across the street, we could see the blinds move
Right.
up and down because she was the guardian. And if we did anything untoward, then my mom and dad found out about it from Mrs. Owens
Right.
when we got home.
You got it twice.
So just the standards of living and everything were incredible then. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of Envision and the idea of being world-class and globally connected. A lot of people have got to see the world, but few see it from your perspective. What do you think is South Carolina's sort of assets and liabilities in trying to be world-class in this new digital age?
I always go back to people that I know and that I consider to be icons from South Carolina. Governor Riley is my idol. Former Governor Hollins, Senator Hollins.
Right.
Because we had some difficulties in the family, he became a friend of my mom and dad's, and he and I used to talk all the time, here in D.C. Because I had to go before, when he was still in the Senate and was on the Commerce
Right.
Committee, I had to go before him once when I was being considered
Right.
to be the Deputy Administrator at NASA, and he told the story about having been so angry when he found out about how I got to the Naval Academy.
Right.
And how I didn't get to the Naval Academy from South Carolina. He swore that there would never be another African American qualified who couldn't get an appointment from the state of South Carolina. And he made changes. Governor Riley started the governor's school up
Right.
in Greenville. And they were people who were really good people who knew the capacity and capabilities of South Carolina. Can't remember which governor it was that actually started the ball rolling with the tech system, tech
Right.
schools, Midland Tech,
Yep.
all of them now all over the state. When you may remember, when I think it was Toyota wanted to come in and open a plant, we didn't have anybody who could do,
Right.
who knew what metrics was. Our kids were not technologically advanced.
Right.
And so, the governor said, okay, that's not going to happen again. And that's what we have to see start to happen again down in the state. And we've done it in the past. We've done it under much more stringent and dire circumstances than we are today. So it can be done again.
Well, is there some asset of South Carolina that you think we are failing to utilize, failing to leverage?
I don't. I'm certain there is. I don't know because I'm not there enough, but I do know that here at NASA, we've tried to establish collaborations with the South Carolina State Museum.
Yeah.
We recently signed a Space Act agreement with the university for the new Ron McNair Center for Aeronautics Excellence. We've got Boeing down in Charleston now, and we're a partner with Boeing in terms of aviation development and the like. So, we're all doing our part to try to make sure that the state kind of grows and everything. I think the biggest thing is we have to refocus our efforts on education, particularly STEM education. The state has to decide that it wants to seek academic excellence in its students, and that's hard. And I always remember telling people I could close my eyes and I knew when I was crossing the South Carolina-North Carolina line. South Carolina always had the best roads in the country. Lousy schools. North Carolina, worst roads in the country. Incredible schools, incredible public schools when I was growing up. It may be swapped now. Coming out of the university, you know what you all are trying to do.
Yeah.
And my knowledge from Thad Bell, Raymond Bino, who's an alum of the medical college, and my cousin, who's now up in Columbia, a surgeon, they are people who really want to see the state succeed. And but education is the key, and we've got to get back to the point where we really push our kids in STEM education, and we support them when they decide they're going to do that. And so you can't knock public education, you can't knock education in general. There's a place for collaboration between private schools, public schools. Here, a lot of places around the country, we use public charter schools with great success, but it takes a lot of work.
Assume for the moment that you retire from NASA and you're looking around with your wife and folks say, well, we ought to get together and make Charles Bolden King Charles of South Carolina. And the folks bring you back and put you on the throne in Charleston and say, okay, what shall we do? What would you do as King of South Carolina?
I don't deal in hypotheticals.
And you can't resign. You got to be king.
No,
you can't
I don't deal in hypotheticals. Somebody will get a wrong idea. Now, I would send my granddaughters back. I've got brilliant granddaughters, and I would love to see one of them go back. But I'm beyond my prime.
You're beyond your prime?
I'm ready to go fishing whenever I leave here.
Well, we got a lot of good fishing places.
But I got a lot of work. We have a lot of work to do here. We're hoping to have commercial crew capability here in the United States by 2017. That's really exciting. Trying to make concrete plans and get vehicles ready to go to Mars, which a lot of people, a year ago, I think people kind of snickered when we talked about that. I don't think too many people are snickering anymore because they're starting to see real vehicles and real plans and stuff like that. And humans have always dreamed of going to Mars. And just knowing that I'm a part of getting ready to do it. I won't be here when we do it. I'll be alive. I won't be here at NASA headquarters. But I'm gonna be tickle pink in my rocking chair somewhere.
Well, assume for the moment that there's some kid in C.A. Brown or elementary school and somewhere in South Carolina says, I want to be the guy. I want to be the one that goes, or girl that goes to the Mars. What do you tell them to do?
I tell them, forget it right now as a student. Study really hard. I mean, really focus. Make sure they get a good, solid background in math and science. Try to go to school to become an engineer or a scientist, but that's not absolutely necessary. It's ideal if you want to guarantee that you're going to be one on the spaceship. Pick the military as an alternative. That's the way I did. Let them send you to school, send you to flight school, that kind of stuff. And then once you've got a technical undergraduate background, try to get some grad school in, and then say, okay, now I'm ready, and start writing NASA and putting your application in. If you get a chance and you're doing some research, look for an internship or a co-op opportunity with NASA. We've got 10 centers around the country. Everyone is excellent in some particular field, and a student cannot go wrong by spending a summer or a semester or a few days, with NASA. You're here in the studio. We actually take co-ops in and put them in our communications department. A kid that wants to be a journalist, they can come here and they see the best journalism in the country. They see news being made every day, but also being produced and put on television, put on, podcasts and newspapers and stuff like that. They can't do that on the outside now. In a lot of places, there are not a lot of outlets that put out news. We put out news.
Right.
It's space news. But,
well, it's good news.
Yeah, it's great news. So I would encourage them to study really, really hard. And then the final thing I tell them is don't ever be afraid of failure. Don't step back like I did and say, no, they'd never pick me, because you don't know. It's like Ron McNair told me, how do you know?
How do you know? But just a final question, thinking about South Carolina and where you came from and our assets and liabilities and where we're trying to go in the globally connected world, are you optimistic that South Carolina is sort of on the right track? Are we doing the right things from your perspective, or do we still have a lot of speed we need to pick up?
Well, I think everybody needs to pick up a lot of speed. But when I look at the things that I'm familiar with, when I look at because I know Boeing Company,
right.
When I look at them, they're excited about being in Charleston.
Right.
With the 787. When I look at what's going on with the governor's schools, or the South Carolina State Museum now that's really excited about the prospect of opening a facility that's going to be one of a kind in the United States of America, that has a planetarium, an observatory, a large screen theater, and a domed theater. No, right. That won't exist anywhere else in the United States.
That's world class.
That's big stuff.
That's big stuff.
That's big stuff.
Well, you have to come back and dedicate it and help us find all the next generation of Charles Bolden.
I promised them I would do that the last time I was there, and I'm looking forward to it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much. Envision South Carolina, world class, globally connected.